It looks like a medieval altarpiece, but it is actually a photographic montage by French photographer Pierre Dubreuil entitled Entombment of Christ, Triptych. The work dates back to 1900. From the end of the 19th century up until the First World War, Europe's leading photographers sought to rival painting. All kinds of painting. (1910), again by Pierre Dubreuil, a photograph entitled Interpretation, Picasso, The Express Train. The reference to Cubism is clear, the image less so. One has to observe it closely to recognize the photograph of a locomotive. The express train referred to in the title, reworked and accentuated in charcoal, rendering both locomotive and photograph unrecognizable. This disguise, known as Pictorialism, was the response to a crisis. Half a century after it was invented, doubt was cast over the true nature of photography. Another locomotive, filmed by the Lumiere brothers in 1896. Paradoxically, the photography crisis coincided with a boom in the photographic industry. These workers are leaving a photographic equipment factory. The invention of cinema was tangible evidence of the vast technical progress that had been made. At the same time, cinema seemed to assert the essentially documentary nature of the silver image. It was a revolution that had been equaled only by the digital revolution we know today. Increasingly precise lenses, increasingly small cameras, and increasingly rapid emulsions came onto the market. Printing was still done via the direct contact of the negative and positive enclosed in a wooden frame, but paper had by then become so sensitive it could be exposed to just a simple gas lamp. Don't be a fossil. Use a modern lens. Get up-to-date results, urges this advert. Pictorialism is primarily a refusal of this command. When Edward Steichen published his self-portrait in Camera Work, the main Pictorialist magazine, he portrayed himself not as a modern man, but as an artist of a former era, of the ancien régime, so to speak. His portrait echoed a certain nostalgia for hand-produced painting, as opposed to work done by machines. The very subject matter of the image seeks to erase its mechanical and chemical nature. To become artistic, photography had to get away from itself. It had to be non-photographic. A Dutch interior painted by Pieter de Hooch in 1658. A Dutch interior in the style of Pieter de Hooch, photographed in 1908 by Italian photographer Guido Rey. At the beginning of the 20th century, Guido Rey was one of the rare photographers to continue practicing literal pictorialism, a practice that was as old as photography itself. The resulting anachronism brings a smile to our lips. The camera's mechanical eye coldly records the situation for what it is. And a reconstruction flatly lit by such strong light, the photographer had to pencil in the window frame that the overexposure had virtually erased. Pictorialists wanted to free themselves from the camera's mechanical objectivity. To do that, some of them tried to get rid of the lens, replacing it with the simple round opening, the pinhole, the darkroom known since antiquity. This is the technique English photographer George Davidson used in 1890. Producing this image with its ill-defined contours, the onion field. The image became a reference for the pictorialists, who subsequently used more sophisticated resources, such as these telephoto lenses. They were used not to photograph incognito and from afar, but for the magnificent soft focus produced by their shallow depth of field. To achieve the same effect, they also used special lenses they called soft focus lenses. For the pictorialists, a clear image was the product of mathematical correction, whereas soft focus images were closer to the eye's natural imperfection. The details became less sharp, leaving the major masses of the composition to emerge, as in this photograph, The Bridge, Ipswich, 1903, by American photographer Alvin Coburn. In this other photograph by Coburn, the soft focus makes the image vibrate. The house and the trees appear to be animated by a life of their own, producing a disconcerting trembling, explained by the title, The Haunted House. In France, the inventor of the soft-focused lens, Commander Pouillot, demonstrated their efficiency by using two images of the same model. On the left, a normal lens, the image is clear, a little too clear. On the right, Commander Pouillot's soft-focus lens, which miraculously erased all the freckles of the model. It was also to test new lenses that Alfred Stieglitz, the leader of American pictorialism, photographed this young model, taking great care to make it clear to her, if we are to believe his memoirs, that he was not looking on her as a woman. The soft focus plays a dual role here. Not only does it lend an erotic finish to the image, accentuating its intimate character, but at the same time it makes it artistic, and therefore acceptable. We are no longer looking at a naked woman, but the artist's vision of her. For Stieglitz, soft focus was also a way to animate a still image. In this portrait of Miss Hare, dating back to 1904, he managed to catch a fleeting impression, the feeling of real presence, as though the young woman had just turned towards us. This movement is further accentuated by the angle of her bust. This soft focus, which the French call flou artistique, artistic blurring, became a formula that could be used to ennoble the most banal of images. For those who could not afford to buy special lenses, the magazines were full of helpful advice. Photographers could, for example, remove the lens and replace it with a lens from a pair of spectacles. They could also attach a string to the lens, pull it taut by placing it under their foot, then rub it with a violin bow to make it vibrate gently during the shooting. The result was not systematically successful. In 1894, Étienne Jules Marey photographed a cat falling. Marey's chronophotography, requiring exposures of just a few tenths of a second, was further proof of technical progress. But the pictorialists looked down on this new way of controlling time, considering it just about appropriate for scientific photographs. To what they termed the interrupted motion of the snapshot, they preferred the still motion of the pose. The Man in Armor, Self-Portrait by Frank Eugène, 1898. Posing went hand in hand with a predilection for eternal themes. Youth contemplating reality, an allegory by Spanish photographer Juan Villaloba. But it was probably American photographer Holland Day, posing here as a Renaissance artist for his friend Steichen, who carried out the most astonishing feat. synthesizing both snapshot and eternity in 7 successive poses, illustrating Christ's last words on the cross, duly encased and captioned. Christ is portrayed by the photographer himself. The succession of poses seeks to translate the temporal gravity of the tragedy of the Passion right through to the last image with its decidedly modern framing. Not content with imitating great painting, the pictorialists also focused on minor genres, with the cutout silhouettes that had been in fashion since the 18th century. Profile of Alfred Stieglitz. Profile of Edward Steichen. The profiles are indeed photographs, and the method for creating them was featured in camera work. The subject must be placed in front of a window with sky all around it and photographed using a lens that costs at least $100. The pictorialists were very keen on silhouettes against the light with their elegant and enigmatic appearance. Edward Steichen went overboard on the technique in this portrait of Rodin, depicted in profile in front of his famous thinker. The 2 silhouettes stand out clearly against a lighter background, in which Victor Hugo, another work by Rodin, seems to be floating like a great ectoplasm in a spiritualism session. The silhouette creates depth in all senses of the term. It enables the photographer to oppose an atmospheric background and a clearly defined foreground. Wapping by Coburn, 1904. This type of composition was strongly influenced by the Japonism in vogue in the early 20th century. The influence of Japonism can also be seen in the choice of atypical formats, such as these popularized by the painter Bonnard. Grace by French photographer Pierre Dubreuil, 1902. To dramatize the distance between the child and the vase of flowers, the photograph has been elongated like a bookmark. This provides a rather forced effect, in contrast to these 2 images by Stieglitz, in which the vertical format is naturally dictated by the subject matter, the silhouette of the tree, and that of the Flatiron skyscraper. This skyscraper was the pictorialist's favorite building, and was photographed by Steichen in 1904 as well as by Coburn in 1912 in an image that reproduces the atmosphere of a New York street at dusk, with delicacy and depth. It was also from America that the major revolution arrived. 1889, the first Kodak camera. In 3 simple gestures, photography was now within everybody's reach. To detach themselves from this new mass of amateur photographers, the pictorialists refused this simplification of the act of taking photographs. On the contrary, they sought difficult, technical exploits. Their efforts produced this snapshot taken by French photographer Robert de Machy on the fly, on a Brittany beach around 1910. At first sight, it appears to be far removed from pictorialist aesthetics, but that is neither here nor there. The photographer transformed it, pictorializing it in his laboratory, giving it contrast, straightening out the horizon, and bestowing on the child in the foreground the picturesque beauty of a silhouette against the light. Likewise, in 1914, German photographer Heinrich Kuhn Japanized this color photograph of a mountain excursion by adding a foreground of foliage appearing from nowhere against the light. In another print, in black and white this time, he opted for the more ordinary background of a mountain. For the pictorialists, laboratory work took on a new significance. More than the actual shot itself, the printing process became the critical moment. The Franco-American photographer Paul Haviland printed using cyanotype, a process that had fallen out of fashion due to the fact that its blue hue was considered too artificial. Haviland used this unreal effect to enhance an intimate portrait of his model Florence Peterson. On this other shot, the process's absence of nuance lends a particular style to the image by reducing it to a vivid interplay of light and shade. Other photographers, on the contrary, cultivated the art of the nuance to extremes. Steichen deliberately opted to photograph the most difficult situations, such as this lake in the moonlight taken in 1904. The image was subtly colored during the printing phase by adding successive layers of various coloring substances. The secret of Steichen's prints, and those of most of the pictorialists, was the handmade manufacturing of paper based on pigment processes, the most well-known of which is gum bichromate. The paper is coated with a gum arabic solution of potassium bichromate and colored pigments. When the paper is exposed, the gum hardens in relation to the quantity of light that the negative lets filter through. Then the image is not developed, as in the silver-based processes, but washed in tepid water or cleared, to use the specialist's term. In the light areas, the solution disappears. In the dark areas, it remains, retaining the color of the pigment. Clearing is done with a paintbrush. In this process, the painter's gesture becomes a reality. Pigment processes require great mastery. They produce unique, highly refined prints, like these miniature landscapes by Czech photographer Drittikol. The way they are presented on cards of different color highlight the stylistic affectation of these images, which wavers between naturalism and symbolism, with a predilection for night scenes bordering on abstraction. In a more clearly symbolic register, an allegory of mourning entitled In Memoriam by Steichen, 1904. The pose is conventional, but serves merely as a pretext for portraying the great exploit of depicting the chiaroscuro, the smoothness of the skin, and the various substances. The subject matter is eclipsed by the artist's approach, an approach that Steichen asserted by signing the image not once, but twice. As well as the signature, the prints are presented in such a way, mounted and framed like drawings or engravings, as to make the viewer forget they are simply photographic prints. Perhaps we will be accused of wiping out a print's photographic nature, but that is exactly our point, stated Robert Demachy. In order to do so, Demachy did not hesitate to set to work on the negative itself with a process he called touching up with a chisel. The negative of this nude has been scratched and repainted so as to wipe away the secondary details, here the decor, in an effort to bring out the subject, certain details of which are accentuated. The pose is academic, but the scratching creates a sort of vibrating form around the model and is the one true mark left by the artist's hand. Here, unlike the effects of printing, the original itself has been irreversibly reworked. One of the most astonishing images of this type of work applied to the support is by German-American photographer Frank Eugene. When detached from its natural background, this simple workhorse becomes an archetypical horse. But on closer inspection, we discover that the photographer also specifically wanted even, to remove from his print the man with a hat holding the horse by its reins. A more moving image, also by Frank Eugene, depicts Adam and Eve after the fall. The scratches project the image into the present, giving us the impression we are witnessing the artist's struggle against the restrictions of his support. But despite its old-fashioned theme, it is also a very modern way of denouncing the photographic trompe-l'œil. It is a reminder that what we are seeing is merely a flat surface coated with a sensitive solution. Rather than placing the photographic image in opposition to the intervention of the artist's hand, Robert de Machy sought to blend them into each other in this surprising work entitled Composition Tournante, or Whirling Composition, created in 1905. Here, the sketching and painting endeavor to dissolve the contours of the photographed figure, dragging her into a whirling motion. It's an admirable technical feat, but the blend does not really gel, and this radical pictorialism remains a curiosity, a dead end. In 1901, during the golden age of pictorialism, the magazine Camera Work published a pastiche of the Hamlet monologue, "To paint or photograph? That is the question." 10 years later, the question was answered once and for all. Stieglitz published The Steerage in Camera Work. It was a manifesto for straight photography, for the direct photograph that rejected all printing modifications, the entire pictorialist array of effects. The focus was once again on shooting, on the photographer's vision capable of extracting from reality perfectly mastered images, all the more striking for their natural appearance. On seeing this print, Picasso allegedly commented, "Stieglitz photographs the way I paint." Photographing was indeed painting, but painting only with sunlight. Sun rays, Paula. A photograph taken by the young Stieglitz in 1889 before his Pictorialist period. "28 years later, we find the same lines of light and shade in Porch Shadows, the work of a young photographer who advocated absolute objectivity, free of any doctoring or process. He was called Paul Strand. The image was published by Stieglitz in the very last issue of Camera Work. It was the epitaph of Pictorialism, the end of this long and beautiful interlude. And Steichen himself, who in 1903 photographed himself as a painter, photographed himself again in 1917, this time as a photographer.